Buried in ancient clay is a version of David and Goliath no one teaches. Not a story about bravery, but a story about what happens when something not fully human finally falls. A shepherd boy, a giant, a single stone. One of the most retold stories in human history. Schools teach it. Churches preach it. Hollywood adapts it again and again. But here is what nobody ever tells you. The Bible describes Goliath as over 9 foot tall, armored in bronze, carrying a spear the weight of a weaver's beam, and his brothers, 4 of them, each described with extra fingers, extra toes, the same huge frame, the same genetic signature, appearing again and again across the same bloodline. The official explanation: he was just a large man, an impressive fighter, a strange human outlier who happened to have very large siblings. But 3 years before the first modern archaeological dig in Mesopotamia, a Sumerian clay tablet was pulled from the earth near the ancient city of Nippur. And what it described did not just challenge the Bible story. It described where Goliath's people came from, what they were made for, who made them, and why they were placed in Canaan in the first place. That tablet sat in a museum archive for decades before a translator noticed that the cuneiform inscription was not using the standard Sumerian word for human. It was using a completely different word, a word that appears only 4 times in all of recorded Sumerian literature. A word that means, roughly translated, those who were shaped to carry the burden of the gods on earth. Once you understand what that phrase actually means in Sumerian belief, David and Goliath stops being a story about courage. It becomes something else completely. Let's start where most people don't. Not with David, not with the battlefield at Elah. Let's start with a biological problem that has bothered physical anthropologists for most of a century. Human gigantism as a medical condition comes with a specific and consistent set of effects. It is caused by too much growth hormone, almost always traced to a tumor on the pituitary gland. People born with this condition do grow unusually tall. But the same hormone that causes that height also causes severe joint deformity, chronic pain, poor heart function, damaged vision, and a much shorter lifespan. Most people with clinical gigantism in the ancient world would not have lived long enough to become soldiers. Certainly not elite warriors able to lead an army into long battles. Now look at Goliath's profile in 1 Samuel 17. He is described as a champion, a trained fighter, a man who had spent years in active warfare. His armor alone weighed over 125 pounds by the Bible's own estimate. He carried it easily. He was mobile, coordinated, tactical. He gave a formal military challenge that required a level of lasting physical function completely inconsistent with clinical gigantism. The profile is not of a sick man. It is of a superior one. And then there are his brothers. In 2 Samuel 21, 4 additional giants are named. Ishbi-Benob, Saph, a brother of Goliath of Gath, a large man with 6 fingers on each hand and 6 toes on each foot, and 1 more of exceptional height. All descended from what the text calls the Rapha, the same word translated elsewhere as Rephaim. This is not one man with a growth disorder. This is a family line, a bloodline, the same traits repeated across multiple siblings. Polydactyly, meaning extra digits, combined with extreme height and clear physical superiority. That is not a random mutation. That is an inherited trait cluster. And in the ancient world, an inherited trait cluster that consistently produced warriors of this kind would have been recorded, protected, maintained. The Bible calls them the Rephaim. But the Rephaim do not start in the Bible. That is where the tablets begin. The civilization of ancient Sumer emerged in southern Mesopotamia around 4500 BCE. That is not a disputed date. What is disputed is how they got there. Within a few hundred years of their first settlements, the Sumerians had advanced mathematics, complex irrigation systems, a written language, a working legal code, an astronomical calendar accurate enough to track full planetary cycles, and a cosmological framework describing the origin of the human species. They did not build towards civilization slowly. They appeared, as the academic phrase goes, fully formed. And for over a century, historians of the ancient world have struggled to explain this. No gradual progress, no clear trial and error period. The structure of a complex civilization arrived in the archaeological record, as if someone had simply switched it on. The answer, according to the Sumerians themselves, was that they had help. That explanation is written in their own words on thousands of clay tablets, and it begins with beings they called the Anunnaki. And before we go further, I need to pause for a second, because what I am about to tell you gets much darker. And I realized a while ago that some of this cannot be fully explained in a video format. The complete decoding of all 12 codes, the tablet numbers, the translated passages, the astronomical date they gave down to the degree. I put it all into a written document. It is linked below, and the QR code is on your screen. Now let's continue. The cosmological framework they left behind in thousands of clay tablets recovered from across Mesopotamia describes a race of beings they called the Anunnaki, translated in different ways as those who from heaven came or the princely offspring of An. According to the tablets, these beings arrived on Earth before the rise of modern humans, built the first cities in Mesopotamia, and later decided they needed a workforce to run their operations. The Sumerian tablets, especially the Atrahasis epic and the Enuma Elish, describe a genetic engineering project. The Anunnaki, according to the text, combined their own biological material with that of an existing earthly species to make a hybrid worker race. That hybrid race was called the Lulu Amalu, the Lulu. Here is where it gets specific. The physical characteristics of the Lulu described in some of the lesser-known tablets, not the main epics, but administrative and inventory tablets recovered from sites like Lagash and Eridu, describe beings of unusual size. Beings whose physical labor ability far exceeded ordinary humans. Beings described as being shaped with the proportion of the Watchers. And the word used for Watchers in this context is the Sumerian term Igigi, a class of Anunnaki connected with the sky domain. Now trace that forward. The Hebrew Bible uses the word Nephilim to describe the offspring of the sons of God and the daughters of men in Genesis 6. The word Nephilim shares its root with the Aramaic word Nephilah, which means the fallen ones. And the word Rephaim, the family line Goliath belongs to, is used in the Hebrew text to describe a pre-Israelite population of great warriors living in Canaan, occupying the same territory the Israelites were later told to take by force. The link between the Sumerian Lulu, the Nephilim of Genesis, and the Rephaim of the later books of Samuel and Deuteronomy is not a strange connection made up by conspiracy theorists. It is a documented language and text thread running through 4 different ancient languages: Sumerian, Akkadian, Aramaic, and Hebrew across more than 2,000 years of recorded history. It describes the same group of beings, always bigger, always more powerful, always living in the same geographic corridor between Mesopotamia and Canaan, always appearing at the exact places where the Sumerian texts describe Anunnaki territorial operations. The tablet I want to focus on is known in academic literature as CBS 14220. It is kept in the collection of the University of Pennsylvania Museum of Archaeology and Anthropology, recovered from the Nippur excavations that began in 1889. Most of the Nippur tablets get discussed in the context of religious hymns, administrative records, and mythological stories. CBS 14220 is different. It is classified as a lexical list, a classification document. Ancient Sumerians created these tablets to classify beings, jobs, objects, animals, and living things. Think of them as ancient encyclopedia entries written in the careful language of a civilization that valued precision above all else. This particular tablet contains a section listing categories of living beings. Within that list, there is a subclassification using the term Adena, a compound word scholars have translated with some difficulty. The most literal translation is those of the large measure. Some translators have rendered it as those of extraordinary span. The beings in this subclassification are not listed under the category for animals. They are not listed under the category for ordinary humans. They appear in a section that, based on nearby entries, classifies beings described as the product of divine engineering, beings created, not born in the natural sense. The distinction is clear in the tablet's form. Unlike the mythological epics, the Atrahasis or the Enuma Elish, which worked within a story tradition, allowing for poetic compression and symbolic numbers. A lexical tablet was an administrative tool, a classification instrument. Scribes used them to standardize terminology, train apprentices, and keep consistent records across city-states. When a scribe writing a lexical tablet listed the height of a being as 3 times the human standard, he was not using a metaphor. He was recording a measurement. When he listed a digit count above 10, he was entering data. Within that subclassification, the tablet describes physical attributes, a height compared to the standard cubit measure that is about 3 times the height of an ordinary man. Depending on which cubit standard the scribe was using, the short cubit of about 17.5 in or the royal cubit of about 20 in, that translates to a being between 8.75 and 10 foot tall. The tablet also lists what appears to be a number note for digits on the extremities. The notation uses the Sumerian sign system to show a number greater than the standard count of 10, 6, and 6. Not as a symbolic reference, not as a ritual number. Listed in a classification document alongside physical measurements, in the same way a scribe would record the number of legs on a horse or the weight of a standard load for a donkey. Clinical, descriptive, matter of fact. This tablet comes before the Book of Samuel by at least 800 years, based on careful dating of both the tablet's physical composition and the writing style used by the scribe who wrote it. The Sumerian scribe who created CBS 14220 was recording beings with 6 digits on each hand and foot who stood about 3 times the height of an ordinary man, classified in a category of divinely engineered living things. The Israelite scribe who wrote 2 Samuel 21 was describing Goliath's brother as a man with 6 fingers on each hand, 6 toes on each foot, of unusual height, born to a giant. Different scribes, different centuries, different languages, different civilizations, the same physical description. Here is something that almost never gets discussed in mainstream study of the Goliath story. The geography. The Rephaim were not a wandering people. They had specific territories, fixed locations. And when you map those locations against the ancient Sumerian and Akkadian records of where the Anunnaki built their first cities on Earth, the overlap is not close. It is exact. This alignment has been noted by researchers working where Mesopotamian studies and biblical archaeology meet. And what it shows goes, well, beyond a coincidence of location. The pattern is consistent, repeating, and deliberate. Every Rephaim location matches a point in the Anunnaki territorial network described in the Mesopotamian record. Before we move on to the next section, stop for a second. What you just heard about the CBS 14220 tablet is the part that changes everything. But it only makes sense when you see it written out next to the original Sumerian notation. The population number, the classification markers, the size data. It is all in the document linked below. Take 5 seconds right now, grab it, and then come back because what comes next builds directly on it. The link is in the description. QR code is on your screen. The Sumerian texts place the original Anunnaki settlements along the lower Euphrates Valley in the region of what is now southern Iraq. They named specific cities, Eridu, Nippur, Lagash, Ur, as the first places the Anunnaki established what the texts call the Me, loosely translated as the divine functions or the codes of civilization. From that central zone, the texts describe an expansion. The Anunnaki set up stations, outposts, across a defined corridor moving northwest through what is now Syria, and then south into the Levant, the coastal strip between the Jordan River and the Mediterranean Sea. That corridor, called in some tablets the Path of the Watchers, runs directly through the territories named in Deuteronomy, Joshua, and Samuel as the homelands of the Rephaim, Bashan, the valley of Jezreel, the hill country of Judah, the coastal city of Gath, the city that gave Goliath his name. Gath of the Philistines sits at the crossing of the coastal plain, and the Shephelah lands at the exact geographic entry point to the territory the Israelites were commanded to conquer. This is not a coincidence of location. The Rephaim appear again and again in multiple books of the Bible at the exact points along this ancient corridor where you would expect to find Anunnaki outposts, border zones, strategic high ground, defensive positions protecting ancient routes. And when the Israelites entered Canaan and began their conquest, What was the first thing Moses sent scouts to report? Giants living in the land, the sons of Anak, described as descendants of the Nephilim. The scouts came back so terrified they compared themselves to grasshoppers in the giant sight. That is in Numbers 13, before the book of Samuel, before Goliath. The Rephaim were already there, and the ancient Sumerian record suggests they had been there for reasons far older than any Israelite migration. Let's step out of the ancient texts for a moment, because there is a modern scientific thread to this story that has been mostly pushed aside in mainstream archaeology. Not because the evidence does not exist, but because the institutional resistance to its meaning has been strong enough to keep it on the edge. In burial sites across Israel, Jordan, and Lebanon, skeletal remains dated to the Iron Age period, roughly 1,200 to 600 BCE, have shown unusual features. Femur lengths inconsistent with standard human proportions. Skull dimensions extending past the normal range of human variation. And in multiple cases, confirmed polydactyl markers in the hand bones. 6 metacarpal positions per hand. Congenital, present from birth. Documented, but never widely publicized. Here is what the genetic science does support clearly and without controversy. Polydactyly is an inherited condition. It follows autosomal dominant inheritance patterns, which means if one parent carries the gene, each child has a 50% chance of inheriting it. In a closed population, a clan, a tribe, a bloodline that marries within itself, that trait can become dominant within a surprisingly small number of generations. If the Rephaim were a closed genetic line descended from a common ancestor, carrying both the height markers and the polydactyly markers, then the pattern described across the Bible, multiple siblings, all giants, all with extra digits, is genetically coherent, not miraculous, predictable. The question is where that original ancestor came from. The Lulu Amalu, as described in the Atrahasis epic, were produced through a process the tablets describe using the Sumerian word nakmatu, which translates as either to shape by hand or to mix. The process involved biological material of the Anunnaki combined with existing earthly biological material to produce a new being designed with specific traits. Strength, endurance, physical ability beyond the ordinary human baseline. Traits that, once introduced into a population, would remain and grow in later generations. If the Rephaim were a later version of that genetic line, concentrated over centuries in the Levantine corridor, then their biological profile is not miraculous. It is the expected result of an inherited trait cluster maintained through a closed population over several hundred years. So here is the question that pulls everything together. If the Rephaim were a genetic bloodline descending from Anunnaki-engineered beings, and if the geographic evidence places them exactly at the locations the Sumerian texts identify as Anunnaki outposts, what were they doing there? The standard religious answer is that they were an obstacle, a people to be pushed out as part of God's covenant with Israel. But the Sumerian texts suggest something far more specific. The Anunnaki, according to the tablets recovered from the ancient library at Nippur, divided the earth into regions. Each region was assigned to a specific administrator, called in the text an En, meaning Lord. These regions were not random. They matched areas of special resource value: mineral deposits, farmland, water access, trade routes. The Levantine corridor was one of the most strategically valued regions in the ancient Near East. It sat at the intersection of 3 land masses, controlled the coastal trade routes between Mesopotamia and Egypt, and contained copper deposits in the Sinai and timber in Lebanon. Whoever held it could watch movement across a huge stretch of the ancient world. The Sumerian texts describe the Anunnaki placing guardian forces at key territorial boundaries, beings of hybrid origin who served as border enforcers. The word used in several tablets for these guardian figures is Mashu. Translate that into the biblical story. The Rephaim are not randomly spread across Canaan. They are consistently located at the territorial boundaries, at the entry points, at the defensive positions along the routes any invading force from the east would need to pass through. Goliath was not standing in a random valley. The Valley of Elah sits at one of the main access routes from the coastal plain into the Judean hills. It is a military choke point. The exact kind of position a guardian force would hold to prevent a territorial breach. He was not just a champion fighter seeking personal glory. He was a boundary enforcer doing exactly what the Sumerian text described the Mashu as being designed to do. David did not kill a bully. David defeated a designated guardian of an Anunnaki territorial assignment, a being descended from a genetically engineered bloodline placed in the Levant for the specific purpose of stopping conquest of that corridor. And when David's stone brought Goliath down, within the cosmological framework these tablets describe, it was the moment a divinely guided human bloodline ended the last working line of Anunnaki-engineered territorial enforcers in the Levant. For brothers, all gone by the end of 2 Samuel 21, the last of the Rephaim. Here is the part that brings all of this into the present tense. The books of Enoch, especially 1 Enoch, which is part of the Ethiopian Orthodox biblical canon, but was removed from the Western canon during the Council of Laodicea in 363 CE and formally excluded from the Latin Vulgate Bible. 1 Enoch describes in direct story detail the descent of the Watchers, the Igigi of the Sumerian texts, onto a mountain called Hermon in the northern Levant. It names 200 of them. It describes what they taught humanity, metalworking, warfare, enchantments, and clearly the genetic mixing of their kind with human women. The offspring of that mixing are called the Nephilim, and 1 Enoch gives their physical measurements. Giants of 300 cubits. That number has been argued by scholars to be symbolic. But when you cross-reference it with the more careful measurements in the Sumerian lexical tablets, the Adana classification using a 3 times human height ratio, you are looking at a range of 9 to 15 feet, depending on your cubit standard. The Book of Giants recovered from among the Dead Sea Scrolls at Qumran takes this further. It names specific Nephilim giants. It uses language that, when compared directly with passages in the Atrahasis epic, shows structural and thematic parallels so exact that scholars of Second Temple Judaism have spent careers debating whether these texts share a common Mesopotamian source. Based on current evidence, the answer is yes. The Sumerian tradition, the Hebrew apocryphal tradition, the Dead Sea Scrolls, and the canonical books of Samuel are all drawing from the same foundational account, describing the same beings, the same bloodline, the same geographic footprint. The only version that stripped out the cosmological context, that removed the origin story, the genetic explanation, the Anunnaki framework, is the version that became the official Bible of Western Christianity. And that was not an accident. The church leaders who decided the biblical canon were making deliberate choices about what framework humanity would use to understand its own origins. A version in which God created humans directly once for a specific purpose is theologically simple and institutionally manageable. A version in which a more complex species engineered humans as a hybrid labor force, then left behind a warrior bloodline to guard their territorial interests, raises questions no religious institution is prepared to answer. So that version was removed, but it did not disappear. It was carved into clay thousands of years before anyone decided what the official story would be. And it is sitting in museum archives right now in Philadelphia, in Baghdad, in London, in Istanbul, waiting for the right translator to look at the right tablet and ask the right question. Here is what we know. The Sumerian lexical tablet CBS 14220 describes a class of divinely engineered beings with unusual height and extra digits, classified separately from both humans and animals, placed in a geographic corridor matching exactly the territories occupied by the biblical Rephaim. The Rephaim show an inherited trait cluster combining extreme height and polydactyly, genetically consistent with a closed bloodline keeping Anunnaki-derived traits across multiple generations. The geographic placement of the Rephaim matches the Sumerian description of Anunnaki territorial outposts and designated guardian beings along the Levantine corridor point for point. The apocryphal texts that preserve the fullest account of these beings, 1 Enoch and the Book of Giants, were removed from the official biblical canon in the 4th century CE. And the story that survived David versus Goliath was stripped of every piece of cosmological context that would have explained who Goliath was, where his kind came from, and why defeating him mattered beyond a single valley south of Jerusalem. The tablet the Bible could not hide has been sitting in Philadelphia since 1889. And the beings it describes were not monsters, not myths, not random genetic oddities who happened to be tall. They were the last of something designed, the last of a bloodline engineered to serve a purpose. And when the last of them fell in the valley of Elah with a stone in his forehead, something older than recorded history quietly ended.